Well, welcome. I'm delighted to have everybody here with us today. I'm Jennifer Mnookin. I'm Dean here at UCLA Law School, and this is actually the second installment of our Conversations with the Dean series. And our guest today, it's both a professional and personal pleasure to get to introduce her. We have with us the extraordinarily accomplished attorney, Homeland Security expert, author, mother, and Angelino, Juliette Kayyem, with us today. Her wonderful book, which came out this past spring, is Security Mom, an unclassified guide to protecting our homeland and your home. And it's also a really, it's a fun read. And we have them for sale outside afterwards, and I would recommend it to all of you. Juliette has really had an extraordinary set of professional experiences and has played a pivotal role in protecting our homeland. She served as the Department of Homeland Security's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs under President Obama. And in that post, she played a very important role in the government's response to crises, including the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, among other disasters. Before serving in the Obama administration, she was Homeland Security Advisor to the Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. And she's also served as a member of the National Commission on Terrorism, as a legal advisor to former U.S. Attorney Janet Reno, as a trial attorney and counselor in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, among a variety of other roles. She also had a very interesting run for the governor of Massachusetts at one point, which she may talk to you about. She's also, on top of all of this, a remarkable writer. You'll find this both if you read this book, which is both compelling and very readable. But in 2013, she was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for her editorial columns in the Boston Globe, which advocated for ending the Pentagon's rule excluding women from combat, which, as many of you may know, was also changed back then. Among her many other affiliations and appointments, Juliette is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a variety of other advisory committees. She also serves as the Belfer Lecturer in International Security at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she provides instruction to new leaders in emergency management and homeland security. On top of all of that, she is also a mother of 3 children, and she writes about these various roles in this book. And I'm also very pleased to say that I've known Juliette since about the end of college. Yeah. So we go back a long ways, and that her parents, who can wave from the back of the room there, that coming back to UCLA also let her come back and spend a little time with them, and that her father, Bob, they're both UCLA graduates, and her father, Robert Kayyem, is also one of our UCLA Law School graduates. And so it's really, I mean, Juliette has done such a remarkable array of different activities during the course of her career. And it's just, I could not be more pleased than to have her with us today.
That's
so
great.
welcome.
Thank you.
So yes, let's give her a very warm welcome. So thank you for being with us. So I get to ask you lots of questions now, which is pretty cool. And I guess the first one I'd like to ask you about is really just to talk a little bit generally about Security Mom and about what led you to write this book. Yeah. Now, you know, I'm a mother also, and I'm also the dean of a high-profile institution here at UCLA, and we're all affected by national security. Right. There's just no question, given all of the threats around us. And so I'd love your thoughts on how we live, work, and travel and go about our lives without either sacrificing our values, giving in to fear or bias, but also while taking reasonable precautions.
Right.
What would you tell us?
No, it's a great question, and part of it was, I think for a long time, well, first of all, thank you. It's so great to hear my parents thank you because I came and visited, but without the kids. So as you learn when you have kids, you're sort of irrelevant.
Right.
So, but
I apologize. No grandchildren.
No grandchildren. They had school. But I'm really grateful to be here. I actually grew up off of Hillgard, so I made my parents show us the old house and went to Westlake when it was still Westlake. And so it's amazing to be back. So I think the answer to your question was, I didn't know the answer to your question until I got out of government because, and I describe this in the book, that you're sort of in the middle of it and you're thinking about security and fixing things and solving things and saving lives and dealing with hurricanes and terrorists and oil spills and all the things that one deals with. And so it was really not until after that I realized our meeting, my apparatus capacity to speak to all of you had been very poorly nurtured, and that we talked to the American public in a way that either made them tune out or freak out. And those were the only two options. You had no others. And for one, I mean, looking at a lot of you who are young in the room, I mean, first of all, your consciousness is not necessarily 9/11. I mean, it happened in your lifetime, but you're thinking about, you know, the economic crisis and other issues that have gone on. So how can we get better about describing what it is our obligations to each other are and the risks that are out there? And so I decided to tell that story as a memoir because it seemed to me that was a way that I could get people to relate to it as parents, as children, as family members, as people engaged in their communities. Because Homeland Security, whatever the risk is, terrorists, earthquakes, cyber attacks, hurricanes, whatever it is really about three core functions. So just thinking about it this way. I mean, the first is minimizing risk, right? The obligation the government has to minimize the risk. Note that I say minimizing risk and not eliminating risks. In a country like ours, you are never going to eliminate the risk. We are too big, too vibrant, too mobile, too amazing in many respects. The second is just to think about it in terms of maximizing defenses, right? So what do you want to do either to stop a bad thing from happening, but also if it does happen, how do you defend yourself better? So that's a lot of support for first responders, but it's not just that. It's supporting each other in our communities. It's the Red Cross and volunteer efforts. It's Airbnb. I'm on the security board of Airbnb right now. We just are deploying our disaster management in Florida and South Carolina, opening up all Airbnb homes free of charge. So thinking of ways that we can actually help each other. And then the third piece, and the one I talk about a lot, is actually maintaining our spirit as a nation or community, making sure that whatever we do to address the first two things, we don't become something that we look back at and don't like what we see. And so, and if those sound familiar, it's because that's actually what we're doing in our everyday lives. And so I tell that as a mother, you know, like, look, seatbelts, bike helmets, right? I do all sorts of things, but I'm never going to get the risk to zero. And I think if, as a nation, we could recognize that our vulnerabilities are actually something that we should accept, I think that's a good thing.
That's great. You use sometimes the phrase, there's a lot of wonderful turns of phrase, but one of them is don't scare, prepare.
Yeah.
Right? Can you talk a little bit more about what that means? What's the balance between enough fear that we're...
And being like, why am I not a survivalist, right? Okay,
That's right.
So I mean, that's exactly, no, because people are like,
my question.
no, people are like, you should do
Right.
survivalist kits. I was like, that's kind of against the gist of what I'm trying to say, which is, so there's like, basically what I tell people is, you know, take 2 hours. That's all it takes. And you can reduce, you know, you can get 80% of the way there. So I'm not trying to say, you know, under every scenario that you can imagine, from nuclear war to, you know, Ebola, you can protect yourself, but there's just like basic things that what we say, in my field, or after the boom, right? So you think of the bad thing happening. At those moments after the boom, what would you wish you had done, which would have taken you 5 minutes that you haven't done already? Now, we're in California, so a lot of you have already done that in terms of earthquakes. But the main thing, and when I say grip, is just take ownership of your own safety and security. And I think, you know, and that's a sort of response to the failures that the post 9/11 world presented to the American public. Like, oh, give it to the experts like me, never again, we'll protect you, all that sort of language. And the truth is, that's just bogus. That's not going to happen. There's a lot that you can do to minimize the risk. So it's not just preparedness. A lot of it is actually communication. In particular, parents sort of assume that their kids, or they, you know, that they'll just get on the phone and fix things. I think you have to assume that phones won't work. And so I go through a whole list of things that take about 2 hours that will get you 80% of the way there.
So I just want to follow up a little bit. You mentioned another word that you use a fair amount in the book, which is the word grip.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to have a grip? Why should we be aspiring to grip?
Right. So
what's that about?
So it's part of it is just an empowerment thing. So that it's a, you know, as I said, you know, my apparatus after 9/11, which for those of you who are younger, you can't. it's hard to explain the sort of before-after aspects of 9/11 for a generation, in particular for government apparatus. It just changed significantly. The way we thought about threats, the war footing, two war footings, and the way we addressed Homeland Security is what we then called it, but it's been called other things in the past, just changed significantly. And we had this way of thinking about it and presenting it to the American public, which was never again, right? Words of the Holocaust, which is interesting. But this idea that if we only invest enough, go to war enough, take away civil liberties enough, bomb enough, all that stuff, we'll get the vulnerability to zero, right? And we'll protect you. And it was bogus. I mean, we knew it. And anyone in the field knew it. Part of it was a way of talking that, was aggressive. And the story I like to tell is how early we knew it was not, once the Obama administration came in October of 2001, a story I tell in the book, just the fallacy of never again was Bush. There's a story of Bush in the White House. This is only a month after 9/11. The anthrax attacks haven't happened. And Bush turns to his chief of staff and the head of Homeland Security at the time, Tom Ridge, and he says, I've gotten a phone call from the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico. They're complaining about Fortress America because essentially we closed the border. So if this sounds familiar to debates today, you'll understand why. And here's George Bush, wartime president, post 9/11, only a couple weeks after 9/11. And so he says to Tom Ridge, recognizing that the U.S. could not be Fortress America, he said, we have to let go a little. And that's a quote. You wouldn't even think about that as part of what animated us even that early on. And so part of what GRIP is recognizing that stuff happens, and if you sort of reorient yourself to think, okay, stuff is going to happen. I can't stop all bad things from happening, but I can do a lot to minimize the consequences of what that is. That's sort of GRIP. Mm-hmm. And so empower, I end the book saying you're all experts, right? I'm sort of done. There's a lot that government can do to minimize the risk, but just also empowering all of you. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just survivalist kits, it's also just a way of thinking about your life and thinking about communication, I'm in California, but I'll say vaccinations, things like that minimize the risk to, I feel very strongly about it, so unless you want to get me started, I will. But I see the numbers, so I know my audience a little bit. So, so it's a little, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. Well, so stuff happens, right? And that's true both in terms of security issues, but there's also kind of serendipity and unpredictability to all kinds of things, including people's pathways through life. Yeah. And so I want to talk a little bit about yours, because you started out as a civil rights lawyer. And if one had asked you then about the directions that you thought your life would take, probably this phenomenally interesting pathway would not have been what you would have described.
Yeah. Actually, I saw signs for it, the honors program. That's how I got started, was I saw signs for the interview as I got started as a civil rights attorney. And I like to say about my life that I have many jobs but one career, because you can get to the stage in your life, you're like, how does this all make sense? And so you try to write it in a way that makes sense. And have always been interested in sort of the balancing issues. I think that those are comparable. So I was a litigator. I thought I would be a litigator. I thought I'd be civil rights. I interviewed at LDF, and I did all those things and thought that would be my career. But something interesting happened in the later parts of my time. This is in the 90s at the Department of Justice. There was just, it's so quaint now to think about. There were 8 counterterrorism cases at the time. This is before 9/11. And the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, was very concerned about those cases because there were already sort of civil rights, civil liberties concerns about it. It also did not hurt that even though I didn't identify it, I didn't come up the Arab American community, I wasn't engaged with the Arab American community, that I think it helped. I always say it sort of, I'm not a fool, I know sort of helped, I think, in terms of the Justice Department looking at some of these cases. So she, as part of my docket, she asked me to be part of this review. And then, as you say, stuff happens, and speaking to the young people, as I met a guy, or had met a guy, and then he gets a teaching job up in Cambridge. at Harvard Law School and how I know Jen and Josh. And so we move. I quit a job with the Attorney General. I'm like making like $500 a month as like a fellow at the Kennedy School. I'm 7 months pregnant. You can imagine how happy I was. And I'm thinking, you know, this whole terrorism thing is going nowhere. I'm serving on the National Commission on Terrorism, but you know, and it's like August of 2001. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'll have Cecilia in August of 2001, and then I'll think of a career change, because it's just, this is, you know, it's terrorism's so niche-y. And then, and it really was, there's like 5 people in the field. And so then, you know, I don't want to say I was passive about my career, but sometimes events do happen. When September 11th happened, you know, I was on a train to New York that morning with Cecilia. I sort of used my expertise to evacuate the train. There were no protocols at the time. And so my career sort of then happened in ways that I wouldn't have anticipated. Over time, politics, media, all that stuff, they all sort of were part of a general theme about preparedness. And I really switched from counterterrorism, which I actually got a little bit bored of, to be honest, not in a bad way, but I really thought that the bigger challenge was what we call all hazards, was how does a nation like ours prepare for anything that could happen to it? And while 9/11 was the birth of sort of Homeland Security, really in light of what's happening in Florida, Hurricane Katrina was really its course correction. That people like me woke up and thought, wow, we've been so focused on stopping 19 people from getting on 4 airplanes, we can't save 2,000 people from drowning, right? I mean, people didn't die in Hurricane Katrina, they died after. Right, and that's sort of, and so that was a wake-up moment for me about thinking more holistically about the threats we face.
I want to drill down a little bit into the serendipity a bit more. You tell the story in your book of getting a call to join that first commission.
Yeah.
And, you know, our opportunities in life, I mean, given that we do also have a lot of students in the room, our opportunities in life also come from a mixture of preparedness and luck.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you reflect back on that moment.
No,
the
it
way
is.
Yours was about both.
I mean, it's luck. It's the right place. It's saying yes, and I'll bring that up in another instance where this happened. So, so I was advising the Attorney General at the time. I was up in Cambridge, and you know, so you have these moments in your career where you're trying to figure stuff out, and you know, I got a dog. That was like my response to it. I remember, because David doesn't like dogs, and I was thinking, this is my life, okay. And there's something simultaneously going on which I had no idea would impact my life so much. And in '98, Bin Laden planned attacks on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. Mostly Africans died, so the American public was not that engaged with it. But it started a conversation about the growing threat of bin Laden. 99, the USS Cole happens, and Congress creates a commission on terrorism to assess the growing threat of bin Laden in particular. It was a 10-person commission. 10 of them were picked. The 10th pick was someone from California who ended up being rather controversial for reasons that were more sloppiness than ill will. We all speak sloppily at various moments in our public lives, but they needed an alternative. And he was a Muslim American, had no background in national security, didn't have security clearance. And so I tell a story about this controversy. It was a huge controversy in the front pages. You know, Muslim American can't get security clearance for a commission on terrorism, and he had a lot of the more conservative groups were going against him. And I remember my dad saying, who's sitting here, when you read it, saying, well, they have to get a Lebanese Christian with security clearance, but he wasn't talking about me. It was just like sort of this generic thing. That's actually me. And about 2 days later, Gephardt's office called. And part of it was I was on the fence about it. And one of my mentors who had been in the Department of Justice, you just don't say no. I mean, you'll see what happens. First of all, you could quit if you don't like it. But and I think that's what I don't, maybe I don't say no enough, but I don't say no. And also, there was one other moment which I think was when Deval Patrick had been my boss at the Civil Rights Division, and he remarkably became governor of Massachusetts. It was sort of a precursor to what would happen to Obama about 2 years before. And he called after, we supported him, he had been my boss, but he called after, he says, I have to have this thing called a Homeland Security Advisor, right? And, you know, this thing, and will you do it? Basically, he didn't know. And I was like, if I thought you knew anyone else in Homeland Security, I would view this as a compliment. And I got a lot, I mean, he's a progressive Democrat, and says Homeland Security is not known for its progressiveness. And I got a lot of advice not to take it. Oh, it's state government's not that interesting, blah, blah, blah. And I would have never worked for Obama or have had the perch that I've had had I not done that. So some of it is just also go with your gut.
That's great. That's great advice. You talk about a lot of, you already made mention of this, but how it started with counterterrorism,
Yeah.
but then our sense of security grew much broader.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I don't talk or define myself as a counterterrorism expert. If you see me on CNN, it was like a huge fight with them. They've taken off counterterrorism and put national security, because I just was like, that. First of all, the things that we face as a nation are there's a lot of things that we face, and the challenge is, how do you reduce your vulnerability to all risks? I was involved with the Boston Marathon security when I was the state Homeland Security Advisor. At the moment of the bombing, you didn't know if it was a generator, two brothers, Bin Laden back. You didn't know what it was. And that doesn't really matter to first responders or to those who are charged with protecting your life. Like, they are, at that moment, you just want them to respond. And to be honest, the American public, that's all they want, right? There was all this. And so, as I said, 2005 was a pivotal moment for people like me. And for those of you who don't remember, if 9/11 was a shock, right? 2001, 2005, becomes this, it was just depressing. I mean, I don't know how to say, and part of it was the legacy of the war in Iraq wasn't going well, but Bush never rebounded after 2005. The sense of that something was really off. And I think part of it was we had not sort of thought about all hazards. So I really, it's, Zika, Ebola, hurricanes, whatever. To me, it's sort of all the same, that the risks are always going to be there. And then how can we manage them? Never getting it to zero, though. Just remember that.
Right. Well, what about, though, different kinds of risks and how we think about these different categories, both in terms of preparedness, response, and also which of them do pose? You talked about balancing these different conceptions at the beginning, including our sense of who we want to be as a nation. Do different risks pose different kinds of challenges?
Yeah, I think that's right. So let me start with the existential one, which I do think, I know I'm a Hillary Clinton fan and help her out, but Bernie Sanders was right in the sense that if you really thought about the tectonic change national security threat that's coming before us, it is climate change. And I don't mean it like the water is the threat, right? People sort of make fun of him. It is just that the movement of people fighting over limited resources, drought and hurricanes, coastal islands becoming uninhabitable, all of those things are going to happen because of climate change. When you think sort of long-term, what the movement of people responding to that's where conflict arises. And there's a lot of literature to suggest that's true with Syria, it was true with the Arab Spring. And it's certainly going to be true about things like the Arctic, which is melting, to the droughts in Africa, to what we're seeing on the eastern seaboard. So we're going to have to think about, as a nation, how we live. So I have a lot of wonky policy proposals about that. But so that's sort of the big one. In terms of terrorism, our risk perception is really off. And I think it's wrong. And I think Democrats in particular have a tendency to sort of ignore the concerns or want to rationalize the concerns of mothers and fathers for their children, even though, your kid is more likely to die on their bike the next day than ISIS. And the statistics are skewed, right? The 42% of women think they will know someone who's killed by ISIS. It's just crazy. I mean, that is, when you just look at the numbers. So what I say is there's no mocking it. You can't sort of dismiss it. You have to actually sort of accept it, right? That there's a sort of irrational perception about terrorism. And then what I try to do is sort of flip that and go, okay, here's what you can do, right? And sort of prepare yourself, prepare your kids. Because I don't think that there's any way to minimize that. Obama has tried to do that, and I think he's been a little bit flat-footed in that regard. I think his response to Paris and Brussels was maybe his way of doing it is to be very rational, but I think the American public felt that those were different, right? 100 people dying on a Friday night and young people. So I think that there are ways that each risk is different. As I said, like a pandemic, you have to have traveled the world to know why our anti-vaccine debate is so precious. Because you just see mothers losing children. I mean, it's just remarkable, and they would kill for our public health system and vaccination system. And so so there's ways that we can minimize the spread of pandemics or other public health issues. And then hurricanes and Mother Nature, as I said, there's a lot that we can do, including evacuations. I've been on air this morning, and we'll be back on air tonight. Like, there's no messing around. Those of you who've been watching, it's a kind of complicated thing. It is not a mandatory evacuation, but it's also not voluntary. So how do you interpret that? It means if you don't leave, we will not save you. And I think that's good. I think it's about time we tell people enough of you waiting for someone to come save you. You have every capacity to move and preserve limited public safety resources for those who are less able, don't have the resources, handicapped and others.
Although, are we capable of meaning that?
So I think, yes. I think it will be interesting to see what the evacuation rates are like. I think there has been a change since Katrina and certainly since Sandy of talk, and I think it's good. I call it the tough love talk of like sort of just sort of saying, this idea that there's going to be a safety net is the safety net, let's just put it this way, is the evacuation. You know that like famous thing where, there's a very religious woman and she's on a sinking boat and someone comes to save her and she says, no, my Lord will save me. And then another boat comes to save her. She says, no, my Lord has a plan. He'll save me. And then she dies and drowns and is up in heaven. And he says, what happened? I sent 2 boats, right? And so, and so part of it is, I think the evacuation orders are the safety net. And then, because there's going to be long-term damage. If the trajectory appears to be what it is, there's going to be long-term damage. And then people learn. This lesson about, I talk a lot about lessons learned, that a nation like ours that will always have the thing happen, right? And so that's why I talk about resiliency and sort of, you'll never minimize risk. A nation like ours has to invest in a very, very rigorous after action lessons learned. In the military, for those of you who served, it's, this is what they do, right? Something happens and you learn from it. So the after action of Hurricane Katrina, many things wrong, including, building New Orleans in a tub, in the 1800s, but one of the things that they realized was the evacuation orders when the mayor, they came too late, so that's why you're seeing these early evacuation orders. But people like me or in my field study these things. So the evacuation orders made it sound like there was a backup plan. And so when they were said, they went something like, evacuate in a timely fashion, blah, blah, blah. Those of you who can't evacuate, the Superdome will be made available. Now, they said it meaning if you literally can't evacuate, go to the Superdome. They didn't mean it if you don't want to evacuate, go to the Superdome, right? And so the Superdome, as those of you remember, became this hell, right? And because the Superdome was impacted by the hurricane as well, and they just didn't have the resources. So part of the language that you're hearing now, this sort of tough love language, is the backup plan. The Superdome plan is actually your evacuation, and you want to protect first responders because they will be overworked and underpaid for the next week.
You said something to me when we were chatting earlier about how, disasters they're called that for a reason. Yeah. And so when we look back, we're never going, even if we don't scare prepare, yeah. Even if our government makes smart choices about these things, even if people are their best selves, we're going to look back on it, and when we audit and deconstruct, yeah. We're going to find decisions that were probably less than ideal with hindsight. How do we think about that?
Yeah. No, I do. I mean, no disaster response is ever going to look good. So you just want to remember it's a disaster, right? And so what you want to do, as I said, is invest on how you can do it better the next time. So how do you invest in after action and lessons learned and stuff like that? So I talk about that. And that's very familiar to anyone who raises kids and stuff, right? You can try to minimize the risk. Something will go wrong and you learn from it. So I try to bring those lessons in from my own personal life. As I say in the book, you will remember that many parents have locked their kids in a car. Very few of them have done it twice, right? So we actually have internal lessons learned mechanisms. And so part of that is that I think the other thing is every disaster is going to have its unique aspect to it, depending on what it is. So ones that I've worked, like the difference between a public health scare like H1N1 or anthrax, for example, is going to be very different than like the Boston Marathon, which had like a boom aspect to it, and then you respond. And I think it will never look perfect, but you can certainly get it to look better. There's more invested in. And part of the book, I should say, is just like those books like How It Works. I mean, I think like most people don't know how FEMA works. And one of my favorite parts of the book is, how you guys live on the West Coast, but like how is a snow day called? Like for parents on the East Coast and for kids who are like refreshing the button overnight, like, basically, how are
living in hope.
I know, like, hoping, but how I guess I should make fun of LA, like how are rain days closed? Chosen, and so. So a little bit of it is just how does this apparatus work? Because I realize most people don't know, like, what is an incident command structure to a disaster? How does the Coast Guard clean up oil? Like, how do you distribute a vaccine? How are the decisions made about which states and therefore which children get the vaccine first? Like all these things, and then my favorite is just sort of how do you call a snow day, and sort of what is that decision? Because it's not a flip of a coin. There's all sorts of aspects that go into it, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. So part of the book is just here's this world that you hear about, Homeland Security, from immigration to disaster management to terrorism to oil spills, and here's how it works. So at least from the perch that I got to see.
It's great. You mentioned a few minutes ago, I guess in relationship to climate change, but you can take this question more broadly, some of your wonky policy proposals. And we're here at a law school. We like wonky policy proposals.
And they're legal, actually.
So I would love to hear about a couple of them.
I think the big one, so like the lawyer's rule, so I stopped practicing in '99, although dutifully, because my mom's voice is in the back of my head, I've paid bar dues for like another 20 years. Every year I'm like, my mom will be mad, because you never know. And so I haven't practiced for a long time. But the law, and I teach in a school of public policy, so I sort of struggle with the law and the law's role in it. But the law in a crisis and in Homeland Security and security is very relevant because it sets the condition of what action or activity you can take. And so part of what I say, it creates the architecture for how you respond. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, right? Sometimes it limits and sometimes it doesn't limit enough, as we've seen in some of the actions or some of the activities in the sort of post 9/11 national security world. But I think the law can go very far in terms of building a more resilient society. And I talk, or at the end of the book, I sort of, after I'm out of government, I sort of get a chance to reflect in the book. And part of it is just building a more resilient society that we're passing off to our children that is more resilient and has a better architecture, so to speak, than before. So one of those is, or the big one is, for those of you who know disaster management, know about the Stafford Act. It's the way we pay. This is what all the governors are talking about today. We've just, a disaster declaration. And in California, they would do it in an earthquake. And it's a way of the relationship between local states and the federal government about who pays for a disaster. Well, that system was built during Jimmy Carter's era, essentially, when we viewed disasters as random and rare. Right. So all of us as citizens were willing to contribute into a disaster relief fund because there, but for the grace of God, go I. Right. And so you're willing to contribute because that could be you, and then that money will come to you. I just don't think you can realistically say that anymore. I mean, for people who live on the coast in South Carolina or even in Massachusetts, the fact that your homes get flooded every year can no longer be viewed as rare. And the idea of randomness, although disasters are random in some respect, they're not that random. I mean, we know California is more vulnerable to some threats than, say, Massachusetts. So I think the lawyers have to rethink this entire disaster management system, which essentially is, okay, we feel bad for you, something bad happened, we're going to pay you. And we're going to pay you to get exactly this back to where you were. It's the language of disaster, right? Boston Strong, I'm going to get back to where we were. Well, that's crazy when you think about it, right? I mean, why would you want to do that? But that's how it works. So I call it the thank you, Mother Nature, may I have another, right? And then every year, someone comes back and goes, oh, my house flooded. So I would use those funds, and I would change the entire system. And I think lawyers are integral to this, to rethink how you would use these funds to build a more resilient system and to build a more resilient America for the damage that will be done in the future. And so that's sort of where the lawyers come in, although they also come in on the scary stuff like national security and drones and civil rights and civil liberties and all those things as well.
You talk in the book, and also throughout your career, there have been periods where you've had to be away from home,
Yeah.
You've had to commute, you've had to, and you've also been in some pretty scary situations. Yeah. Can you talk about a little about some of those experiences?
Have I been in scary?
Like
I've
that
always
false
been very,
alarm nuclear
Oh
thing?
yeah, I guess I'm right. I guess I were scary.
Although you say lice was worse.
Lice was worse, right. I have taken a shower. I had to go visit a nuclear facility. Massachusetts has a nuclear facility, and then they measure you after. I didn't do anything with the nuclear stuff, but for some reason I got a false positive, so I had to take one of those showers, which are, I felt like I was Claire Danes, like it was like really weird, and like there was like all this stuff around me. But I do remark that my kids also all had lice simultaneously, and I really, the disgustingness factor was much greater then. And but I am very careful. I'm not a first responder. I've been a policy person that oversees public safety agencies, and I don't really risk my life and in those ways, or certainly not in the military. But I do.
You're away from home a fair amount.
I'm away from home a fair amount. So my husband was a law professor, is now a judge. So it's good to marry someone with more stationary jobs. That's the advice I give, and who doesn't like to travel. All these things I didn't know, and that work really well for us. But I do give. I guess I can say this. People will often say, how do you do it? You have 3 kids, your husband has this, amazing job, you have this, great career. And first of all, I always respond, we kind of don't. I mean, in the sense, the idea that this isn't pieced together by Band-Aids and lots of support and, stuff like that. But I think parents, but the women in the room, particularly women, sort of are always looking for a philosophy for how you do it, women can have it all or lean in or whatever. And everyone I know is leaning in. They're leaning in so hard they're falling flat on their face. I don't even know what, I don't even I get it, but I kind of don't. And part of it was, a lesson I learned from women in the military, who, those of you who are from military backgrounds will certainly know this, which is like this sense of sacrifice that animates who they are. And I remember as having one of my, moments of I'm leaving the kids for a long period of time, and especially during the BP oil spill. And there was a military woman, a mother of 3 kids, and she was deploying to, I want to say it was Kuwait. It was not one of the war zones, but she was deploying for a year. A year. Like, I was like, so what's my weekends away or my 2 days away? She was deploying for a year, and I, said, like, how do you do this, right? I was asking the question we're all looking for, like, how do you do this? And she goes, what is her exact line is, we don't, she said, there's no theory. She goes, we just deal. And I thought, that's actually very liberating. You just sort of deal. And I will tell, for those of you, young people are thinking about families and how do you, first of all, you don't have it all and you don't lean, all of it depends on your husband. I think a differential is, are your children healthy? I think that if you have healthy children, that's the differential for most parents about their engagement or ability to engage with career. But I will leave with this note. My daughter is quite funny and humorous, and she had a really hard time. We went down to DC for Obama, and essentially my husband also had a job in national security, so we essentially were not around. We had a lot of help, and family members, my in-laws live there too. And then I was a commuter mom for 7 months, which I never thought I would be. So I'm going back and forth. So I'm not with these kids. My husband is taking care of them. We had a Manny at the time, not a nanny, and so the house was not as clean as I would have liked it. All sorts of stuff, and I come rushing back after I finally resigned and worked for Napolitano, and I'm like, I'm not going to do anything. That's going to be great. I'm going to spend time with the kids, and I'm working out and getting back into shape. So this is February, March of that year. And picking up the kids at school, which like now she's like 10 or 11, so that's like not that great, and or 12. And I'm like home. I'm like, what you guys doing? We're busy. And I remember I was like cooking or something like that, and Cecilia, literally I'm home for 8 weeks, and she hated the way I worked. And maybe she didn't like more sort of this overbearing mother. And she says at one stage, she goes, can you just like try to take a shower before you pick me up from school? Because, when you're not working, you work out, and then you meet a girlfriend, and then, you're like, oh, it's 3 o'clock. And so she says to me about 8 weeks into it, she looks up and she goes, so what are you going to do next? My daughter. And I was like, she's been like complaining for 2 years. So I went back to work. She scares me, so I went back to work like a week later. But just to remember, kids they're not thinking about, this as much as maybe you are, but it was a great moment.
That is a great moment. I'm going to hold on to that one too.
Right.
I'm curious. So you made the decision to try running for office.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that experience, what you learned,
I loved it. It was great and had so much support from people in the room and stuff. We have a funny caucus. All caucus systems are funny, but to even get on the ballot in Massachusetts, I had to get a certain amount of delegates and wasn't able to. Looking back at it, I probably got started too late because you have to build up 15% of caucus goers to get on the ballot. But it was great. Part of my message was, preparedness and government working. I know how, state and federal government, I know how to get government work. A couple takeaways. one was it was very hard to translate Homeland Security to more generally preparedness. So people would, reporters would say, what's your drone policy? I was like, I'm running for governor. I don't have a drone policy. I'm not thinking about drones, but sort of being able to transition it. I think I'm a socially progressive Democrat, but obviously a national security Democrat. Our party, as you certainly know in California, too, is very, in a primary, it's hard for someone like me to get very far. It's just there's the sort of, we had a very Bernie Sanders-like candidate in our race in terms of that sort of progressive agenda, which I'm not against, but it's just not why I was running. And then the third, for women in the room, and I think this is generational, I took on the establishment woman, which was awesome, but boy, was that interesting. There were 10 people in the race, And I think I was the only one, challenging her to be governor. It was a woman named Martha Coakley, and she was the Attorney General. And I think I was the only one viewed as sort of the spoiler. And I think that's a real generational shift. I think women who are younger than me, and certainly me, sort of don't view like two women competing against each other. And I think that's why your Senate race is so fabulous. Like, it's just who's the best candidate. But I didn't get any female endorsements, and I didn't get any of the big groups, NARA, Emily's List. I think that's starting to change politically. But you even hear it like when there was a question of if Elizabeth Warren would get in, a lot of the analysis was, well, two women can't run against each other. And I'm sitting there like, why not? There's like 8 men who were thinking of running. There's a lot of reasons why Elizabeth Warren shouldn't have run, but I'm not sure that was one of them. And so, yeah, but it was great. And just the whole process is just so amazing.
I'm interested, you talk a little bit in the book about your parents' journey to America, and then also about getting your mother's journey to America, and then also about getting your national security clearances, and that retracing some of those pathways. And I guess I'm interested more generally, I mean, as an Arab American security expert, how do you think, how has your background and your heritage and your demographics, so to speak, framed your perspective, if it has?
Oh, I think it definitely has. I mean, I think, I think just having someone with my, obviously the groups turned to me during a lot of these crises, even though I don't identify with any of the groups in the sense I didn't rise through the ranks of the Arab American Institute or whatever, so that I'm a voice. I think I perceive longer term issues rather than short term sort of hostility. So you look at the long view on a lot of these things. I mean, profiling obviously is something that one takes seriously if your family looks a certain way, right? But I think I also think I can serve as a model in that world. What I say a lot is, especially with Trump, who just doesn't get it in so many ways. But I think there's a national security establishment. That national security establishment was Republican and Democrat for all of its flaws, right? And it certainly has plenty of them, because that's the same establishment that supported the war in Iraq, which I did not. But for all of its flaws, it tells you something, that establishment is not only anti-Trump, but a lot of them are pro-Hillary. Because they're worried so much. And what I try to remind people is, if you asked what makes America safer, I don't use the word safe, we'll never be perfectly safe, but safer, there are 2 things. One is our geography, our oceans help. You can't drive from Boston to Damascus. That's going to be very different than the challenge that Europe is facing right now. But the other is integration. I mean, to view integration, not assimilation, but integration as a security thing, right, as a security policy. Because we don't have populations of immigrants hostile to the nation that they are now nationals of. So you think of, the Mexican population here, or the Arab population in Dearborn, or the Irish population in where I live in Massachusetts. And to really think of integration rather than hostility towards the other as a affirmative safety and security policy, that it has minimized the risk. We are not Europe. And Europe has a long-term security problem, which is thousands of their citizens are going to Syria to fight in a war and fight against them. So thinking about it that way.
Wow, yes. To bring it closer to home, there's been an earthquake warning here in California.
That's why I'm here.
Yes, right, exactly.
You planned this last minute.
I feel more prepared already.
I was thinking it would be like, because I happen to be in places where bad things are happening. And I just thought CNN did
Disaster
find me.
magnet.
Right,
Juliette
exactly.
Kayyem.
Like CNN did find me here for the hurricane. And they said, where are you? Because I have to notify them when I travel. And I said, I'm in LA. And they were like, don't say that they said, they're like, oh, good, if there's an earthquake. And I was like, because, ratings. No, I'm joking. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
So are we getting any good advice from the establishment
No,
about that?
I was really surprised. I mean, you guys have a very sophisticated, I know all these, it's a very small world that I work in. California emergency management is very sophisticated. LA, at least LA emergency management is, and FEMA Region 9, which you're a part of, is one of the best. But after the earthquake warning, I went on like the websites. I went on for the emergency management agencies because I hadn't looked in a while. I was sort of curious, what are they advising now? What are the earthquake protocols? And at least for the first 48 hours, I don't know now after the warning, none of them had changed. So like if you looked on California emergency management, it was like some cyber protection thing. And I'm like, no one cares. I mean, you just announced a 1% chance of there being an earthquake. So part of it is, if you're going to take seriously, or if we are going to take seriously, what I say, which is, harness the capabilities and goodwill of the American public in anticipation of a crisis, you got to give them the tools to do so. And so I was really surprised. I don't know if you guys feel it, but like there was like this announcement, and then it's like, okay, we're all, sure.
Yes.
Yeah. That was your sense. Like, yeah.
Yes, it provoked a conversation at my dinner table about whether my kids knew where we kept the water, but that
Yeah.
was about it.
Right. No, I think that's because you have to imagine in anything of magnitude, or not even magnitude. Boston Marathon, the phones were down for about 6 hours because what happens in emergency, this is the how-to aspect, is the telecom services mostly, or the cellular services, they will move bandwidth over to public safety. So even assuming that the system is up, there's going to be a less of a capability or less of breadth because they've purposely moved it over to all the first responders. So things you didn't know that you know now. So the system is working. Like when your phone doesn't work, the system is working because hopefully the firefighters who have to communicate are talking to each other. And so the big thing is just make an assumption about there'll be no cell service. So, how do you communicate assuming no cell service?
So I think we have just a few minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. So if there are questions, I'll give you a minute to just think about what you might like to ask. And then we can take a couple of questions from you. Yes.
Thanks for the humor and the lightness. I was afraid I would sleep.
No. Those are the other people. Yeah.
Excellent. My question is, what should be the guiding principles as to how much we should be willing to sacrifice in the way of civil rights, and how much should we be willing to tolerate for people of profile?
Yeah. So great question. So obviously I don't believe it's static, and so there's going to be moments when maybe it's more appropriate for government to act in certain ways. I don't think we're there yet, and the reason why profiling in particular isn't an effective response to the threat we have now, because counterterrorism now is whack-a-mole. I mean, it's not. There's broad movement within a community. Let me be blunt here, the Muslim community, that it's okay to be over-inclusive because then we'll get the person. I mean, the terrorist threat knows no geographic limitations. It's not like it's not like if you said, in Michigan, right? None of these attacks are coming out of Michigan. They're coming out of other areas. So part of it is because the terrorist threat is more like whack-a-mole, you're just getting these guys radicalized. They tend to be ISIS-inspired rather than directed. Really, the only response is community engagement. Because in all of these cases, guess who knows? It's the ex-wife or the mother. It's one of those two, every single one of the cases. I will say, because I'm at a law school, and I had written in this before, even if you're willing to assume government should have more authority, I think the next question for lawyers is, what series of checks will you have on that authority? So, do you want to set up a FISA court review? Should the provision be sunsetted? All sorts of things that can limit extraordinary powers if we decide we go that way, because it's not just giving government that authority, it's what kinds of curbs on government would you want, in particular in public health scares. Because while terrorism is an issue and we talk about profiling, where governors have a lot of authority is in public health pandemics. And you saw that with Christie and Ebola.
Dale.
Well, I guess a related question, given your multifaceted experience, Edward Snowden?
Yeah.
Hero, traitor?
I love it.
Edward Snowden.
Okay,
hero or traitor?
I know, that was another question I got on the campaign, and I was like, trying to think, oh my God. So now I'm not running now. I think traitor. Just pure, and I'll tell you, so for one, not just his activity after, which I'll get into, sort of the going to Russia and the aspects of it. He even admits that he disclosed information that stopped covert operations because they were exposed. So even if you give him the best argument that he wanted to expose a surveillance program that he thought was unlawful, even though we've now learned it had been disclosed to Congress, to do so in such a way exposed activities, sources and methods that ought not to have been exposed. The New York Times admits it, he admits it, and I just think that for me, and my own biases is, you're sort of a creature of your profession and all the rules that are set up because of your profession. Like maybe others can view him as a hero, but for me, having spent my professional life going through the security clearances, having, being in the skiff, being in the situation room, I just can't imagine doing that, So I'm willing to admit I'm a creature of my profession.
One final question.
So I'm just wondering, you mentioned that you kind of identify yourself as a national security Democrat, and also just going off of your last answer, I'm curious if you ever struggle with the fact that, at least stereotypically, that's not as common among Democrats, and maybe more of a Republican. I hesitate to say that, but
well, the word Homeland. I mean, the word Homeland itself, you just want to scream. It's like.
yeah, it's not a great name.
Yeah. No, it is. It's so. I can disclose things that have been disclosed. So I'm helping Clinton on the Homeland Security strategy, and so one of the things that I think, so Democrats really run from this stuff, and I should go back a little bit. I was on Obama's transition for Homeland Security. Remember, this is a Republican creation, the Department of Homeland Security. It is a creation out of 9/11 and the war in Iraq. It's all, and here's Obama with hope and glory and whatever, and we're like, terrorism, hurricanes, oil spills, immigration enforcement. We're not hope. Let's just put it that way. And so that struggle is sort of how do they pay attention to us, whatever. And I think over the administration, I think Obama came to realize, certainly I think the BP oil spill was that moment where he will be judged by how he responds, because he saw, as I said, Bush never was able to respond to Hurricane Katrina. His polling, people think it was the Iraq War, it wasn't. His polling, and it never went back up after 2005, after the Hurricane Katrina, and I think the BP oil spill ended up being that for Obama. And it's a real, real challenge. I mean, because we Democrats tend not to view this as a happy place, not that we're happy, but it tends to traditionally be about war. What I try to do in the book is say, actually, there is a progressive way of thinking about Homeland Security. It's empowerment, it's community engagement, it's preparing yourself, it's about the home, and have that resonate as sort of a progressive answer to the, any ladies in the room, anytime a man says, we just have to be more aggressive, you're like, what does that mean? I have no idea what that means, but that's the language of it. And so finding ways that it can be more intimate was actually what animated this book, because we weren't feeling it. I have to say, the Democrats are not there yet. Like Tim Kaine's answer on, they got a question on Homeland, is a 5-part plan of which no mention of the Homeland. And if you're sitting in Ohio, let's just be honest here, I could care less about the Shia-Sunni split in Islam 3,000 years ago. I really could care less, right? I want to know, are my kids safe? And I think us leaning into that would be very helpful.
Well, on that note, we are about out of time for questions, but if you'd like to see more of Juliette, we are also having an event this evening in the Law Library, sponsored by UCLA Law Women Lead, and it will be a book talk, and together with Professor Kristen Eichensehr will be there as well. So feel free to join us there if you'd like. I think it will be interesting, enlightening, fun, and hopefully there will be no earthquakes and it will all be quite secure. And we're also going to have a reception out in the hallway, and there are books available as well. But for the moment, let's give Juliette a very big hand for joining us.